Up to this point, we've mostly been doing content-centric AJAX. I now want to look at data-centric AJAX. So in content-centric AJAX, which is what we've mostly been doing so far, the server-side program builds exactly what we need. It's either a string or possibly even a chunk of HTML with tags included. And then the client-side JavaScript code takes that content and just slams it into the page or possibly puts it in a pop-up alert box. But the client-side JavaScript code doesn't need to look inside the string to decide what to do. And the client-side JavaScript doesn't need to modify the content that comes from the server. It merely inserts it into the page or sticks an alert box without examining it and without modifying it. With data-centric AJAX, on the other hand, the server-side program doesn't send a plain string or a chunk of HTML. It sends real data. Now, the definition of real data is a little bit fuzzy, but the most common format for real data is JSON, which we saw in the JavaScript section on objects. But you could also send XML, the original acronym AJAX. The X stood for XML because it was thought at the time that that would be the common data format for exchanging data between the server and the JavaScript program. Or you could even make up your own format. That's not all that unusual. You could just send a string containing, say, 2 numbers with a space in between, and the client-side code reads the 2 numbers and then as strings and then parses them into real numbers and does something with those values. So after the client-side program receives that data, it needs to do some extra work. It needs to read the data and, based on information in that data, build a string or a chunk of HTML. And that string, the string that your client-side JavaScript code built, that's what's inserted into the page, not directly the content that came from the server. Now, content-centric AJAX is certainly a lot simpler. It takes the data from the server and you just stick it in the page. And you can argue that your server-side code and framework is more powerful than your client-side code in JavaScript, even with jQuery. So if something's difficult, you ought to do it on the server, not on the client. And the server is relatively fast, and the client is relatively slow. So content-centric AJAX has certainly done a lot in real life. But data-centric AJAX also has a lot of benefits. In particular, reusability. If you're going to send a data structure describing some employee information, this could be used in lots of different pages. More than one page could use the same raw data but do different things with it. And in fact, server-side services that produce JSON are already common. There may be some of those lying around already. So why not just have access to them? So both approaches are done. I would say that if content-centric AJAX gives you enough flexibility, you ought to do it because it's simpler. But if you need to parse the results and decide what to do based on them on the client side, you can't do that on the server side, then data-centric AJAX is a reasonable choice. Both are widely done in real life. Okay, if you recall the section on objects in JavaScript, we introduced JSON and we talked about strict JSON. So kind of informally, JSON is a string that contains JavaScript code inside of it, or JavaScript data structures inside it. But more formally, you have to put quotes around your object properties, and those must be double quotes, not single quotes. Normally, you don't put quotes around the property names, only the property values, and either single or double quotes are allowed. And so jQuery enforces the strict definition of JSON. You can't just put kind of an arbitrary JavaScript data structure, although you could in very early jQuery versions. Now, technically, the official site for JSON says that you have to specify a particular MIME type coming from the server. Nobody actually does that, and no client-side libraries, including jQuery, actually enforce this. All right, so if you want to do data-centric AJAX in jQuery and you want the data from the server to be in JSON, here's what you do. So first of all, the server needs to produce some JSON. If you practice with this, you can just make a simple text file. Having a server-side program that builds JSON is beyond the scope of this class because we're looking at the client side of the process. But you can practice just by making a text file. But the text file should contain a line, and that line should look like strict JSON. In particular, have quotes around the attribute property names, not just the attribute property values. Okay, so the server should produce some JSON. And then when you call to it with $.ajax, you add a new option, data type, and you say JSON. What this means is that the handler that you supply to $.ajax no longer gets a string. It now gets a JavaScript object. In other words, you don't have to write code in your handler to read the string and then pass it to eval if you're old-fashioned, or JSON.parse if you're new-fashioned. jQuery does this for you automatically. So what arrives at your handler if you say data type JSON is an already parsed JavaScript object. So imagine that this is the data that comes from the server. It has 3 properties: the CTO, the CEO, and the COO. And I'm sure John Resig, Bill Gates, and Larry Ellison work together all the time, so this should be no problem. And so you pass in not the string, but the actual JavaScript object. And so you can do normal JavaScript code to access the properties: the CTO property, the CEO property, and the COO property. It's not a string at this point, it's an actual JavaScript object. However, you don't have any strings or HTML yet to insert into the page, so you have to build one. So you build a string possibly containing HTML tags, and inside that string you make use of various features of the JavaScript object that came from the server, and then you insert that resultant string, the string that you built, into the page.